The fluorescent lights of Iron Gate Federal Penitentiary's death row hummed with their constant, maddening drone, a sound that Marcus Reed had learned to tune out over 12 years of confinement. Cell D47 measured exactly 8 feet by 10 feet, dimensions he'd memorized during countless sleepless nights when the weight of injustice pressed against his chest like a physical force. March 15, 2024. Another Friday in a place where days bled together into an indistinguishable mass of gray concrete and steel bars. Marcus sat on the edge of his narrow bunk, his 42-year-old frame still lean and muscular, despite the limitations of prison life. His dark brown eyes, which had once scanned hostile territories and countries most Americans couldn't find on a map, now stared at the same crack in the ceiling he'd been studying for over a decade. The breakfast tray slot clanged open at exactly 6:47 a.m., 3 minutes later than usual. Marcus noticed. He always noticed. Situational awareness was a skill that didn't fade, no matter how many years you spent in a cage. "Morning, Reed," came the familiar voice of Officer James Carter, a barrel-chested man in his mid-50s whose gray hair and weathered face told stories of 30 years in the prison system. Unlike most guards who treated death row inmates as already dead men, Carter maintained a peculiar dignity in his interactions. He'd never called Marcus by his inmate number, always by his name. "Morning, Officer Carter," Marcus replied, his voice still carrying the measured tone of someone who'd once given orders in combat situations. He approached the slot and accepted the tray. Powdered eggs, 2 pieces of white toast, and coffee so weak it was practically gray water. Carter lingered at the cell door, which was unusual. His pale blue eyes held something Marcus had learned to read over thousands of interactions. Concern. "You hear about the tension in C Block?" Carter asked quietly, his southern accent softening the hard consonants. "Johnson's crew has been making noise about the new warden's policies, food portions, recreation time cuts." Marcus set the tray on his small metal desk. Outside his barred window, the Montana sky was beginning to lighten, revealing the snow-capped peaks of the Rocky Mountains in the distance, a view of freedom he could see but never touch. "I hear things," Marcus replied carefully. "Walls have ears in here. Word is Derek Johnson's been stockpiling, guards getting sloppy during the 3 p.m. count." Carter's expression tightened. At 56 years old, he'd seen his share of prison violence, but there was something different in the air today. The kind of tension that preceded explosions. "You stay quiet today, Reed. Whatever happens, you keep your head down. You've got your appeal hearing coming up in 6 weeks. Don't give them any reason to—" "I know," Marcus interrupted gently. "I've been keeping my head down for 12 years, James. I'm good at it." It was the first time Marcus had used the officer's first name, and something flickered across Carter's face. Recognition of the strange bond that had formed between a condemned man and his keeper. In another life, they might have been friends, might have shared beers and talked about fishing or football. In this life, they existed on opposite sides of steel bars, connected only by small moments of humanity in an inhumane place. Carter nodded slowly and moved on to the next cell, his keys jingling against his belt, a sound that announced his presence wherever he went in this concrete tomb. Marcus ate his breakfast methodically, each bite measured and deliberate. Discipline was survival. In the Army, they taught him to treat his body as a weapon system that required proper maintenance. That mindset had kept him alive in Kabul, in Baghdad, in places that officially didn't exist on any military record. Now it kept him sane, in a place designed to break men before the state killed them. Through the small window of his cell door, Marcus watched the morning routine of death row unfold. 47 men, each locked in their own 8x10 universe, each counting down to an execution date. Some deserved to be here. Marcus had no illusions about that. He'd seen their case files during library time, read about their crimes in newspapers that were always 3 days old by the time they reached death row. Child killers, serial rapists, men who'd done things that made even hardened criminals turn away in disgust. And then there was Marcus Reed, convicted of murdering 3 people during an armed robbery of a convenience store in Billings, Montana, a crime that happened while he was supposedly sitting in a bar 200 miles away in Great Falls. A crime committed by someone who knew how to disable security cameras, who moved with tactical precision, who left no forensic evidence except for a single fingerprint that shouldn't have been possible because Marcus's prints had been classified military records at the time. The trial had been a nightmare. His public defender, fresh out of law school and drowning in a caseload of 43 cases, had barely mounted a defense. The prosecution presented the fingerprint, presented 3 witnesses who identified Marcus from a police lineup, even though 2 of them had originally described an attacker with different physical characteristics, and presented a narrative that a jury of 12 people who'd never left Montana found compelling. Troubled veteran comes home with PTSD, needs money, commits robbery that goes wrong. What they didn't present, what Marcus's lawyer never discovered, was that Marcus Reed had been a ghost for 8 years of his military service. His records had been sealed, his fingerprints classified, his very existence scrubbed from standard databases because of the nature of his work. Someone had unsealed those records just long enough to frame him, someone with access to classified military files and the sophistication to manipulate evidence. But who and why? Those questions had consumed Marcus for 12 years. In the beginning, he'd written letters, hundreds of them, to military advocates, to senators, to investigative journalists. Most went unanswered. The few responses he received politely suggested he was a desperate man grasping at conspiracy theories. The evidence was clear, they said. The jury had spoken. Justice had been served. But Marcus knew the truth. He'd been in that Great Falls bar watching a Grizzlies game, drinking Coors Light, talking to the bartender about the upcoming hunting season. He remembered it clearly because it was one of the few normal nights he'd had since returning from his last deployment. One of the few nights where he wasn't dreaming about Kandahar, about the operation that had gone sideways, about the choice he'd made that saved 14 lives but cost him everything. The morning count proceeded without incident. Guards moved through death row with their clipboards, marking off names, ensuring all the condemned were still present and accounted for, as if any of them could escape from this fortress of concrete and steel. At 9:15 a.m., the recreation yard opened. Marcus was one of 8 death row inmates allowed out for their daily hour of outdoor time. Alone in a small caged area barely larger than his cell, the Montana air was crisp, temperature hovering around 38 degrees. He did what he always did. Exercises, push-ups, pull-ups on the bar they'd installed, bodyweight squats. Movements his body remembered from years of military training, muscle memory that wouldn't fade no matter how long they kept him locked away. From his exercise cage, Marcus could see portions of the general population yard. That's where he first noticed the unusual activity. Groups of inmates clustered in corners, their body language tense. Guards stationed in towers seemed distracted, looking at their phones more than watching the yard. Everything felt wrong, the kind of wrong Marcus had felt before ambushes, before firefights, before situations went catastrophically sideways. Something was coming. He could feel it in his bones. When the guards called him back inside at 10:15, Marcus moved quickly, without resistance. He passed through the metal detectors, submitted to the pat-down, returned to his cell without a word. The heavy steel door clanged shut behind him with the finality it always carried, a sound that said, "You are not leaving. You will die here." The lunch tray arrived at 11:47, 13 minutes late. This time, it wasn't Officer Carter who delivered it. It was a young guard Marcus didn't recognize, maybe 25 years old, with nervous eyes and hands that shook slightly as he pushed the tray through the slot. The kid was scared of something. "Where's Carter?" Marcus asked. The young guard flinched at being addressed directly. Officer Carter got reassigned to C Block for the day, extra security detail. Marcus's instincts screamed. Carter had mentioned C Block that morning, Derek Johnson's territory. If they'd moved Carter there, it meant the warden knew something was wrong. But if the warden knew, why was this nervous kid working death row? Why weren't there more experienced officers on duty? The afternoon dragged on with excruciating slowness. At 2:30 p.m., Marcus heard raised voices from somewhere deep in the prison, the kind of shouting that preceded violence. At 2:47, an alarm blared briefly, then cut off abruptly. which was wrong because security protocols demanded alarms run for a minimum of 3 minutes during any incident. Marcus stood at his cell door, his hands wrapped around the cold steel bars, every sense heightened. The other death row inmates were stirring now, calling out questions, demanding to know what was happening. But the usual guard responses didn't come. The hallway outside their cells remained eerily silent. At 3:04 p.m., Marcus heard the first gunshot, then screaming, then more gunshots. The rapid crack, crack, crack of weapons fire echoing through concrete corridors, a sound Marcus knew intimately from combat zones halfway around the world. Iron Gate Federal Penitentiary was supposed to be one of the most secure facilities in America. Weapons weren't supposed to exist inside these walls, but Marcus knew better than to rely on supposed to. He'd learned in Iraq and Afghanistan that chaos could erupt anywhere, that violence respected no boundaries, that the difference between living and dying often came down to split-second decisions. The power died at 3:08 p.m., plunging death row into darkness broken only by thin streams of afternoon light through the narrow windows. Emergency lights kicked on, bathing everything in a sickly red glow that made the concrete walls look like they were bleeding. And then Marcus heard Officer James Carter screaming. Not just screaming, begging. The sound came from somewhere close, maybe the guard station at the end of death row's main corridor. The voice of a man who'd shown Marcus dignity for 12 years, now filled with terror and pain. Marcus Reed had been a condemned man for over a decade. He'd made peace with the idea that he would die in this place for a crime he didn't commit. He'd accepted that justice was a myth, that the system was broken, that his appeals would ultimately fail. But in that moment, hearing James Carter's screams, something shifted inside him. The part of Marcus that had been suppressed for 12 years, the operator, the soldier, the man who'd been trained to run toward danger instead of away from it, suddenly reasserted itself. The question wasn't whether he could do anything to help. The question was whether he still had enough of himself left to try. Outside his cell in the blood-red emergency lighting, Marcus heard footsteps approaching, multiple men, weapons being racked, and James Carter's screams growing weaker, more desperate. Marcus Reed closed his eyes and took a slow breath, centering himself the way his instructors had taught him 17 years ago at Fort Bragg. Whatever came next would change everything. The emergency lights cast long, distorted shadows across the death row corridor as Marcus pressed himself against the bars of cell D47, his mind rapidly processing the tactical situation unfolding beyond his confined space. Years of suppressed training bubbled to the surface like muscle memory awakening from a long hibernation. James Carter's screams had become wet, gurgling sounds, the kind that meant internal bleeding, possibly punctured lungs. Marcus counted at least 6 distinct voices in the corridor, all speaking with the aggressive bravado of men who'd seized control and knew it. "Where's the master key, old man?" a voice shouted. Derek Johnson, if Marcus remembered the intelligence correctly. Johnson was serving consecutive life sentences for killing a family during a home invasion in Butte. 6 years into his sentence, he'd become a shot caller, a man who commanded respect through brutal violence and strategic thinking. "I know you got it on you somewhere." The sound of a boot connecting with flesh echoed through the corridor, followed by Carter's muffled cry. Marcus's jaw clenched involuntarily. His hands gripped the cell bars so tightly his knuckles turned white. Through the narrow window of his cell door, Marcus could see portions of the scene. 8 men had taken over the death row control station, 6 inmates in orange jumpsuits and 2 guards who'd been forced to strip down to their undershirts, zip-tied and kneeling on the floor with hoods over their heads. Derek Johnson stood over Carter's prone form, holding what appeared to be a homemade shank, a toothbrush melted and sharpened into a crude blade. But that wasn't what made Marcus's blood run cold. Johnson also had a gun, an actual firearm, a Glock 19 by the profile Marcus could make out in the dim lighting, which meant this wasn't a spontaneous riot. This was planned, coordinated, with outside help. Someone had smuggled a weapon into a maximum security federal penitentiary. "Last chance, Carter," Johnson said, crouching down next to the bleeding officer. "Give me the override codes for the perimeter doors, or I start taking pieces off you." Carter coughed, and even from 15 feet away, Marcus could see the blood spray from his mouth. "Go to hell." the officer rasped, his voice barely audible but defiant to the core. Johnson laughed, a sound devoid of humanity. "You got balls, old man. I respect that. But respect don't mean shit when I'm holding the knife." The other inmates jeered and encouraged Johnson, their voices creating a cacophony of violence and chaos. Marcus recognized two of them. Vincent Caruso, a mob enforcer from New Jersey who'd strangled 3 federal witnesses, and Raymond Razor Phillips, a gang leader from Los Angeles who'd ordered the execution of a rival crew, killing 7 people including 2 children. These weren't men who could be reasoned with. They were apex predators who'd found themselves temporarily free from their cages, and they would kill without hesitation or remorse. Marcus scanned his cell with tactical precision. 8 feet by 10 feet of concrete, steel, and limited resources. His bunk was bolted to the wall, his desk equally immobile. He had a thin blanket, a Bible he'd never read, 3 books from the prison library, a bar of soap, and a towel. Nothing that could be weaponized against armed men. But Marcus Reed hadn't survived 8 years of classified operations by relying solely on weapons. He'd been taught to use terrain, timing, and psychology. He'd been taught that the human body itself was the most versatile weapon system ever created, if you knew how to deploy it. "Hey!" Marcus shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos with the command presence of someone who'd led men in combat. "Johnson! Derek Johnson!" The corridor fell silent. Johnson straightened up, looking toward Marcus's cell with curiosity and irritation. "Who the fuck is calling my name?" "Marcus Reed, cell D47, I've got information you want." Johnson approached the cell slowly, the Glock held casually at his side. Up close, Marcus could see the man was in his late 30s, covered in prison tattoos, with a scar running from his left eye down to his jaw, a souvenir from a knife fight in the general population yard 3 years ago. His eyes held the flat, dead quality of a man who'd committed so much violence that it no longer registered as significant. "Marcus Reed," Johnson said, tasting the name. "The guy who killed those people in Billings. What information could a dead man walking possibly have that I'd want? I know where the backup security protocols are stored. Physical override keys that'll open every perimeter door in this facility without triggering the alarm system." It was a complete lie, but Marcus delivered it with the confidence of absolute truth, a skill he'd mastered during interrogations in Baghdad, when bluffing meant the difference between extracting intelligence and getting your cover blown. Johnson studied him for a long moment. "Why would you know that?" "Because I've been here 12 years. Because I pay attention. Because I've watched them change shifts, watched them update protocols, watched them respond to drills. You think I've just been sitting in this cage waiting to die? I've been studying this place like it's enemy territory." Another truth wrapped around a lie. Marcus had indeed studied Iron Gate's security protocols, but not because he thought he could use them for escape. He'd studied them because his mind needed the challenge, needed to stay sharp, needed to maintain the analytical skills that had once made him one of the most effective operators in Joint Special Operations Command. Johnson's expression shifted slightly, interest warring with suspicion. "Even if that's true, why the hell would you help us?" "Because I'm dead anyway," Marcus said, injecting just the right amount of bitter resignation into his voice. "My execution date is set for June 14th. That's 91 days from now. But if you're breaking out, if you're actually getting out of here, then maybe you take me with you. Maybe I get to die somewhere other than strapped to a gurney with a needle in my arm." It was exactly what a desperate condemned man might say. Johnson seemed to buy it, nodding slowly. Behind him, Carter groaned, and Marcus saw fresh blood pooling on the concrete floor. The officer was running out of time. "All right, Reed, I'll bite. Where are these magic keys?" "Let me out, and I'll show you." Johnson laughed, but it was a calculated sound, not genuine amusement. "You think I'm stupid? You could be lying. You could be trying to be a hero." Marcus met his eyes with the cold, dead stare he'd perfected during interrogations, the look that said he was already gone, already dead inside, already beyond fear or hope. "Heroes are for people who have something to lose. I lost everything 12 years ago. I'm just tired of waiting." The psychology was perfect. Johnson saw what he expected to see. A broken man willing to betray anything for a slim chance at freedom. What he didn't see was the coiled tension in Marcus's muscles, the tactical assessment happening behind those dark brown eyes, the combat-ready operator calculating angles and distances and probabilities. "Vincent," Johnson called out. "Get the master key from Carter. We're letting Reed out." Vincent Caruso moved toward the bleeding officer, and Marcus's heart rate spiked. This was it. The moment that would determine whether James Carter lived or died, whether Marcus could execute what was forming in his mind as a tactical operation. Caruso searched Carter roughly, finding the key ring attached to the officer's belt. As he brought the keys to Johnson, Marcus positioned himself at the cell door, his body language suggesting eager cooperation, while his mind mapped the attack sequence he would need to execute in the next 60 seconds. The lock clicked. The cell door swung open with a metallic groan. Marcus Reed stepped out of cell D47 for the first time in 3 months, the longest stretch between transfers to medical appointments or legal consultations. His legs adjusted instantly to the freedom of movement, muscle memory overriding the momentary disorientation of unrestricted space. Johnson kept the Glock trained on him, smart enough not to let his guard down completely. "All right, Reed, show me." Marcus walked slowly toward the control station, his hands visible, his movements non-threatening. He passed within 3 feet of Carter, who was still conscious, his pale blue eyes tracking Marcus's movement with confusion and pain. Blood soaked through the officer's uniform shirt, spreading across his chest, likely a punctured lung from the stab wound visible near his ribs. "The override keys are in the control panel," Marcus said, pointing to the security station. "Behind the third monitor from the left, there's a compartment that requires both a key and a code." Johnson moved to check, which was exactly what Marcus needed him to do. The Glock's barrel turned away from Marcus for exactly 2 seconds as Johnson leaned over the control panel. 2 seconds was more than enough. Marcus's body moved with precision that shocked even him. 12 years of confinement hadn't dulled the training that had been beaten into his muscle memory during thousands of hours of close-quarters combat drills. He closed the distance to Johnson in 3 steps, his right hand shooting out to control the gun hand, while his left delivered a palm strike to Johnson's temple with enough force to disorient, but not kill. The Glock clattered to the floor. Marcus kicked it away while simultaneously using Johnson's own momentum to drive him face first into the control panel. The impact shattered Johnson's nose with a wet crunch, blood spraying across the monitors. Vincent Caruso reacted fast, lunging at Marcus with a shank. But Marcus had already anticipated the attack. He'd seen Caruso's weight shift, seen the micro-expression that preceded violence. He sidestepped, caught Caruso's wrist, and used a joint lock technique that hyperextended the elbow. Caruso screamed and dropped the weapon. The other 6 inmates rushed forward in a mass of orange jumpsuits in rage. This was where Marcus's training truly showed. He didn't fight them one at a time like in movies. He used angles, used their own numbers against them, channeled their momentum into collisions and chaos. A knee to the solar plexus dropped the first attacker. An elbow strike to the throat put down the second. Marcus grabbed the 3rd inmate's head and drove it into the steel doorframe with a hollow thud. The 4th caught a front kick to the sternum that sent him sprawling backward into the 5th and 6th. Raymond Razor Phillips pulled another shank and came at Marcus with practiced violence. This wasn't his first knife fight, but Marcus had trained against edged weapons with Krav Maga instructors and Navy SEAL trainers. He saw the telegraphed thrust, redirected Phillips's arm, and delivered a hammer fist to the man's kidney that made him collapse like a puppet with cut strings. 30 seconds. 8 men neutralized. Not one of them dead because despite everything they'd done, despite the violence they represented, Marcus Reed wasn't a killer. He'd never been a killer, which was the tragic irony of his conviction for murder. The 2 hooded guards were still zip-tied and kneeling, unharmed but terrified. Marcus moved to them quickly, pulling off their hoods. "Keys?" he said urgently. "Where are the handcuff keys?" One guard pointed with his chin toward Carter's belt. Marcus retrieved them, freed the guards, and immediately directed them. "Get on the radio. Call for medical and security backup. Tell them death row is secure, but we need emergency response for multiple injuries." Then Marcus dropped to his knees beside James Carter, his hands already assessing the damage with the same field medical training that had saved lives in combat zones. The stab wound was bad, between the 5th and 6th ribs, penetrating deep. Carter was going into shock, his breathing shallow and rapid, his skin pale and clammy. "Stay with me, James," Marcus said, applying pressure to the wound with Carter's own shirt, torn and wadded into a compress. "You're going to be fine. Help is coming." Carter's pale blue eyes focused on Marcus with difficulty, his voice barely a whisper. You saved. Don't talk. Save your energy. You've got a wife and grandkids who need you to stick around." Around them, the 8 inmates groaned and writhed on the floor, neutralized but alive. Johnson was unconscious, his face a mask of blood. Caruso cradled his dislocated elbow. Phillips gasped for air, the kidney strike leaving him immobilized but conscious. Security teams flooded into death row 3 minutes later. Dozens of guards in riot gear, weapons drawn, shouting commands. They found a scene that didn't match any protocol they'd ever trained for. 8 maximum security inmates subdued without lethal force, 2 guards freed, and a death row inmate applying combat medical techniques to save a corrections officer's life. As they pulled Marcus away from Carter and forced him to the ground, zip ties cutting into his wrists, he heard one of the arriving officers speaking urgently into his radio. "We need the warden down here immediately. You're not going to believe this, but a condemned man just stopped a riot single-handedly. And the way he moved. This guy has military training, advanced training. Someone needs to pull his file right now." Marcus pressed his face against the cold concrete, his heart still racing from the adrenaline, and felt the weight of what had just happened settle over him. He'd kept his head down for 12 years, played the role of the resigned, condemned man, buried the operator he'd once been beneath layers of institutional compliance. But today, that operator had resurfaced. And now Director Harold Thompson would have questions that might finally lead to the truth about who Marcus Reed really was and who had worked so hard to destroy him. As they dragged him back to his cell, Marcus caught one final glimpse of James Carter being loaded onto a stretcher by paramedics, oxygen mask over his face, but alive. Still alive. Whatever came next, at least Marcus had that. The interrogation room in Iron Gate Federal Penitentiary's administrative wing was deliberately uncomfortable. Hard metal chair bolted to the floor, table scarred with years of prisoner interviews, walls painted an institutional beige that seemed designed to drain hope from anyone who spent too long staring at them. Marcus had been sitting here for 4 hours, still in restraints, watched by 2 stone-faced guards who hadn't spoken a single word since they'd escorted him from his cell. The door finally opened at 9:47 p.m., and Director Harold Thompson walked in carrying a thick manila folder and a tablet computer. Thompson was 58 years old, a career corrections administrator with silver hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and the bearing of someone who'd spent decades navigating bureaucratic warfare. He'd been director of Iron Gate for 6 years, running one of the most secure facilities in the federal system, with an efficiency that made him both respected and feared. But as he sat down across from Marcus, his expression wasn't the bureaucratic mask Marcus had expected. It was confusion mixed with something that looked almost like concern. "Mr. Reed," Thompson began, placing the folder on the table but not opening it yet. "In 32 years working in corrections, I've never seen anything quite like what happened this afternoon." Marcus said nothing, maintaining the neutral expression he'd perfected during countless intelligence debriefings. He'd learned early in his military career that silence was often the most powerful response. It made other people fill the void, reveal things they hadn't intended to share. Thompson studied him for a long moment, then opened the folder. 8 men neutralized in under a minute. Not killed, which is remarkable given that several of them were armed and you weren't. 2 of them are still in the medical ward with significant injuries. Derek Johnson has a severe concussion and a shattered nose. Vincent Caruso has a dislocated elbow that required surgical reduction. But they're all alive. He paused, looking up from the documents. "The guards tell me you moved like someone with extensive combat training. Not just basic military service, but specialized training. Close quarters combat, tactical medicine, threat assessment, One of my officers, who served as a Marine, said you fought like someone from Jaisaki, Joint Special Operations Command. Marcus kept his expression blank, but internally, his mind raced. This was the moment he'd both hoped for and dreaded for 12 years. Someone was finally asking the right questions, but asking questions and believing the answers were two very different things. I served in the Army, Marcus said carefully. Infantry. 2 tours in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan. They teach you hand-to-hand combat and basic training. They don't teach you what you did today in basic training, Thompson countered, his voice firm but not hostile. I've reviewed the security footage from the corridor cameras that were still functional. You executed a disarm technique on Johnson that I've only seen in advanced military training videos. You used joint locks, pressure points, tactical positioning. You controlled 8 violent offenders simultaneously while providing emergency medical care to Officer Carter. Thompson leaned forward, and there was genuine curiosity in his eyes now. The look of a man who'd found a puzzle piece that didn't fit the picture he thought he understood. So I started pulling your records, Mr. Reed. Your military service records. And that's where things get interesting. He turned the tablet around so Marcus could see the screen. It displayed Marcus's DD-214, his military discharge document. But sections of it were redacted, blacked out with heavy bars that obscured entire paragraphs. Standard infantry soldiers don't have classified discharge papers, Thompson said quietly. So I made some calls. Called the Department of Defense. Called the Army's Human Resources Command. Called the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis. And do you know what they all told me? Marcus remained silent, but his heart rate increased. After 12 years of being ignored, dismissed, and treated like a conspiracy theorist, someone was actually investigating. Someone was actually looking. They told me that your records are sealed under national security protocols, Thompson continued. They told me that I don't have the clearance to access your complete military history. They told me that Marcus Anthony Reed's service record is classified at a level that requires approval from the Department of Defense Inspector General to review. Thompson closed the tablet and fixed Marcus with a penetrating stare. Infantry soldiers don't have classified service records, Mr. Reed. But Special Operations personnel do, Delta Force operators do, CIA paramilitary officers do. So I'm going to ask you directly, and I want the truth. Who the hell are you really? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Marcus had dreamed of this moment, someone finally asking, finally investigating, finally treating him like something other than a convicted murderer who'd exhausted his appeals. But now that it was here, he had to be careful. Revealing classified information, even to clear his name, could violate national security laws and make his situation even worse. I can't tell you the specifics, Marcus said slowly, choosing each word with precision. What I did, where I did it, who I did it for, that's all classified. But I can tell you this. I was never just infantry. I was selected for specialized training in 2006. I spent 8 years doing work that officially doesn't exist. And when I came home in 2011, I was supposed to fade into civilian life quietly. But instead, you were arrested for triple murder 9 months later, Thompson said, pulling out another document, the police report from Marcus's arrest in Billings. Except now I'm looking at this case with new eyes, and I'm seeing things that don't add up. He spread several photographs across the table, crime scene images from the convenience store robbery. 3 victims shot execution style, security cameras disabled with professional precision, no forensic evidence except for a single fingerprint on the door handle. The FBI's analysis said the shooting pattern and tactical movement suggested someone with military or law enforcement training. Thompson tapped one of the photos. At your trial, the prosecution argued this proved you did it, that your military background made you capable of this level of violence. But I'm thinking about it differently now. What if someone framed you specifically because of your military background? What if they knew how to make it look like a military-trained operator committed these murders? Marcus felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in 12 years. Hope. It was a dangerous emotion, one that could shatter and leave worse devastation than resignation ever had. But sitting across from Harold Thompson, watching this career corrections administrator connect dots that no one else had bothered to look for, Marcus couldn't suppress it. "My fingerprints were classified at the time," Marcus said quietly. "Sealed in military databases that required security clearance to access. For my print to end up at that crime scene, someone had to have access to those classified files. Someone had to deliberately plant it." "That's exactly what I've been thinking about for the past 4 hours," Thompson replied. He pulled out another document, a letter with an official Department of Defense letterhead. "I called in a favor from a friend who works in military criminal investigations. I asked him to run a background check on your arrest and conviction. He couldn't give me details, but he did tell me something interesting. Your name was flagged in multiple intelligence databases around the time of your arrest, not as a suspect in civilian crimes, but as a person of interest in classified investigations." Thompson's voice dropped lower, almost conspiratorial. "Mr. Reed, I think you were set up. I think someone with access to military intelligence systems framed you for murder. And I think they did it because of something that happened during your time in special operations, something someone wanted buried along with you." The pieces were falling into place. The conspiracy Marcus had tried to explain to indifferent lawyers and skeptical judges for 12 years. But hearing it from someone else, someone with authority and credibility, made it real in a way it had never been before. "There was an operation," Marcus said carefully, weighing how much he could reveal without violating his security clearances. "Kandahar Province, Afghanistan, May 2010. It was a joint task force operation, CIA, Special Forces, and contractors from a private military company. We were going after a high-value target, an Al-Qaeda financier. But the intelligence was wrong. The target wasn't there. What was there was a meeting between the financier and 3 American contractors who were selling him weapons." Thompson's eyes widened. "American contractors selling weapons to Al-Qaeda?" "Stinger missiles," Marcus continued, the words coming faster now after years of suppression. "Chinese-made, but routed through American military contractors. We were supposed to eliminate the financier, but instead we found Americans committing treason. My team captured them, took photos, documented everything. We were going to turn them over to military intelligence for prosecution. But that didn't happen," Thompson said, already understanding where this was going. "No, we were ordered to release them, direct orders from someone high up the chain of command. We were told the operation was being handled through diplomatic channels, that prosecution would compromise ongoing intelligence operations. I refused. I secured the evidence and tried to take it directly to the Inspector General." Marcus's hands clenched into fists, the restraints cutting into his wrists. 2 weeks later, I was pulled from active duty and sent home. 3 months after that, my records were sealed. 6 months after that, I was arrested for triple murder. And suddenly, all that evidence I'd collected, photos, testimony, documents, it all disappeared. My chain of command disappeared. The other members of my team refused to testify, said they didn't remember the operation. "Because they were threatened," Thompson said. "It wasn't a question. Or paid off. Or both." The private military contractor involved in that weapons deal was Apex Security Solutions, a company with billions in government contracts and connections throughout the Department of Defense and intelligence community. They had the resources to make me disappear. They had the access to plant evidence. They had the motivation to silence someone who could expose them for treason. Thompson sat back in his chair, his expression grim. "This is bigger than I thought. This isn't just about you being framed for murder. This is about corruption at the highest levels of military contracting and intelligence operations." "Which is why no one believed me," Marcus said bitterly. "My public defender thought I was delusional. The judge dismissed my claims as conspiracy theories. The jury convicted me in 4 hours. And I've been sitting in that cell for 12 years waiting to die for a crime I didn't commit, while the people who actually murdered those 3 people walk free." Thompson was quiet for a long moment, staring at the document spread across the table. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a decision that would change everything. "Officer Carter is going to survive," he said. "The doctors say if you hadn't applied pressure to that wound and kept him stable, He would have bled out before the paramedics arrived. You saved his life, Mr. Reed. You risked your own life to save a corrections officer when you could have just stayed in your cell and let the situation play out. He stood up, gathering the documents back into the folder. I can't give you back the 12 years you've lost. I can't undo your conviction. That's beyond my authority. But what I can do is make sure people pay attention to your case. I have contacts in the media, in the legal community, in congressional oversight committees. And I'm going to make noise, Mr. Reed. Loud noise. The kind that's hard to ignore. Marcus felt tears threatening for the first time in years, but he forced them back through sheer willpower. Why are you doing this? You don't know me. For all you know, I could have actually committed those murders. Thompson moved toward the door, then paused and looked back. Because I saw the security footage from today. I saw you neutralize 8 violent men without killing any of them. I saw you immediately provide medical care to Officer Carter instead of using the chaos to try to escape. I saw a man who's been trained to kill choose mercy instead. He opened the door, then added one final thought. Heroes don't always wear uniforms, Mr. Reed. Sometimes they wear prison jumpsuits, and sometimes they've been waiting 12 years for someone to believe them. After Thompson left, the guards escorted Marcus back to cell D47. As the steel door clanged shut, Marcus lay on his bunk and stared at the familiar crack in the ceiling. But for the first time in 12 years, he wasn't staring at it with resignation. He was staring at it with hope. And hope, as dangerous as it was, felt like the first real freedom he'd had since they locked him away. 3 days after the riot, Marcus Reed woke to the sound of cameras clicking outside his cell. Through the narrow window in his door, he could see a crowd of journalists with press credentials hanging from their necks, cameras and recording equipment filling the death row corridor in violation of every security protocol Iron Gate normally maintained. Director Harold Thompson stood among them, his expression carefully neutral but his body language suggesting a man who'd deliberately opened Pandora's box and was now watching the chaos unfold according to plan. Mr. Reed, Thompson called out, approaching the cell door. These journalists have some questions for you. You're under no obligation to answer, but I thought you might want the opportunity to tell your story. Marcus sat up on his bunk, momentarily disoriented. In 12 years, he'd never had media access. Condemned prisoners were kept isolated from the press, their stories controlled by prosecution narratives and legal proceedings that happened behind closed doors. But here was Thompson deliberately breaking protocol, creating an opportunity that couldn't be ignored or suppressed. A woman in her mid-40s stepped forward, her press badge identifying her as Sarah Chen from the Washington Chronicle. She had sharp, intelligent eyes and the no-nonsense demeanor of an investigative journalist who'd spent years digging through government corruption. Mr. Reed, I'm Sarah Chen. Director Thompson contacted me 2 days ago with some remarkable claims about your case. He says you're a decorated special operations veteran who was framed for murder by a defense contractor with connections to the intelligence community. Is that accurate? Marcus stood and approached the bars, his mind racing through the implications of speaking publicly. Every word would be recorded, analyzed, potentially used against him. But silence had gotten him nowhere for 12 years. Maybe it was time to try something different. Yes, Marcus said simply. That's accurate. The cameras erupted with clicks and flashes. A male journalist with a Boston accent pushed forward. Can you tell us about the operation in Afghanistan? The one Director Thompson mentioned in his statement? Kandahar Province, May 2010. Joint Task Force operation targeting an al-Qaeda financier. Instead of finding him, we found 3 American contractors from Apex Security Solutions selling Stinger missiles to enemy combatants. I documented the evidence and tried to report it through proper channels. 9 months later, I was arrested for a triple murder I didn't commit. Sarah Chen was typing rapidly on her tablet. You're claiming that Apex Security Solutions, a company with $18 billion in active government contracts, framed you for murder to cover up weapons trafficking? I'm not claiming anything, Marcus replied, his voice steady and measured. I'm stating facts. I have had photographs, testimony from my team, serial numbers from the weapons. All of it disappeared after I was arrested. My military records were sealed. My team members refused to testify. And a fingerprint that should have been in a classified database somehow ended up at a crime scene 200 miles from where I was that night. Another journalist, a younger man with a CNN credential, spoke up. "We've been reviewing the security footage from the riot. You neutralized 8 armed inmates without killing any of them. That's not standard infantry training." "No," Marcus agreed. "It's not." "So what unit were you actually with? Delta Force? SEAL Team 6? CIA Special Activities?" Marcus shook his head. "I can't answer that. Those assignments are classified. What I can tell you is that I was selected for specialized training in 2006 and spent 8 years doing work that officially doesn't exist. When I tried to expose corruption within that system, powerful people decided I was a liability." Sarah Chen looked up from her tablet, her expression intense. "Mr. Reed, I've spent the last 48 hours investigating your case. I've spoken with the detective who arrested you, reviewed trial transcripts, interviewed your public defender, and I found some disturbing inconsistencies." She pulled out a folder and held up a photograph, the crime scene from the convenience store robbery. "The prosecution's case rested heavily on your fingerprint being found at the scene, but according to FBI testimony at your trial, that print was recovered from an interior door handle. The problem is the security camera footage, what little wasn't disabled, shows the perpetrator wearing gloves throughout the entire robbery." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. This was information his overwhelmed public defender had never uncovered, details that had been buried in thousands of pages of discovery documents. "Furthermore," Chen continued, "I tracked down the 2 witnesses who identified you in the lineup. Both have since recanted their testimony. One admitted he was pressured by the detective to identify you. The other says he was never certain, but the prosecutor told him your military background made you dangerous and they needed to get you off the streets." The journalists erupted with questions, voices overlapping in a cacophony of interest and disbelief. Thompson held up his hand, calling for order. "There's more," the director said, his voice cutting through the noise. "Yesterday, I received a call from a former member of Mr. Reed's unit. He wouldn't identify himself, but he confirmed the Kandahar operation. He said that after Marcus was arrested, each team member was visited by representatives from Apex Security Solutions. They were offered 2 choices: sign non-disclosure agreements and receive generous severance packages, or face prosecution for violations of classified information protocols." A heavy silence fell over the corridor. This was no longer just the story of one wrongfully convicted man. This was a conspiracy involving military contractors, intelligence agencies, and systematic witness intimidation. Sarah Chen turned back to Marcus. "Mr. Reed, if what you're saying is true, why didn't your appeals attorneys uncover this information?" "Because the evidence was classified," Marcus replied, frustration seeping into his voice for the first time. "Because my military records were sealed. Because the people who could corroborate my story were threatened into silence. Because the system assumes that juries don't convict innocent people, so once you're convicted, every door closes. Appeals courts don't investigate. They just review the trial record, and the trial record was contaminated from the start." A journalist from Reuters raised his hand. "Director Thompson, you've been in corrections for 3 decades. Why are you risking your career to expose this now?" Thompson's expression hardened with determination. "Because 3 days ago, I watched Marcus Reed save a corrections officer's life when he could have used the riot to escape or simply stayed safe in his cell. I watched him neutralize violent offenders without killing them, then immediately provide emergency medical care. That's not the behavior of a convicted murderer. That's the behavior of someone who still believes in protecting others, even after the system has failed him spectacularly." He gestured to the cameras and journalists crowding the corridor. "And because I've spent my entire career believing in the integrity of our justice system. When I see evidence that system has been corrupted, that powerful contractors can manipulate evidence, intimidate witnesses, and bury an innocent man in death row, I can't stay silent. I won't stay silent." Over the next 2 hours, Marcus answered dozens of questions, walking journalists through his military service, the Kandahar operation, his arrest, his trial, and 12 years of failed appeals. He described the systematic way his defense had been undermined, the evidence that had disappeared, the witnesses who'd been silenced. Sarah Chen recorded everything, her journalistic instincts clearly sensing a story that could define her career. "Mr. Reed, I'm going to be completely transparent with you. I'm going to investigate every aspect of your claims. I'm going to contact Apex Security Solutions, the FBI, the Army Criminal Investigation Command, everyone involved. If you're lying, I'll expose that. But if you're telling the truth, then you'll help expose one of the biggest injustices in the modern federal prison system," Thompson interjected. "And maybe, just maybe, we'll see justice actually served for once." As the journalists were finally escorted out, Marcus returned to his bunk physically and emotionally drained. But before the corridor returned to its usual isolation, Officer James Carter appeared, walking slowly with assistance from a younger guard. His chest was heavily bandaged and he moved with obvious pain, but he was alive and mobile just 3 days after nearly bleeding out. Carter approached Marcus's cell, his pale blue eyes red-rimmed but clear. "Reed," he said quietly, his voice still weak but steady. "I wanted to thank you personally. Doctor said if you hadn't known exactly where to apply pressure, hadn't kept me stable, I wouldn't have made it." Marcus gripped the bars, looking at the man who'd shown him dignity for 12 years. "You treated me like a human being when everyone else treated me like a number. It wasn't even a choice, James. Of course I helped." Carter nodded slowly, then glanced around to ensure no other guards were in earshot. "I talked to Director Thompson, told him everything I've observed about you over the years. The way you carry yourself, the discipline, the way you read technical manuals and military history. I always knew there was something different about you, but I figured it was just my imagination." He leaned closer to the bars, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "I also told him about the night you first arrived at Iron Gate. You remember? You were being processed, and there was a commotion, a guard being attacked by an inmate in the intake area. You started to move toward it, started to react like you were going to intervene before you caught yourself and froze." Marcus remembered. It had been his second day at Iron Gate, and his combat instincts had nearly overridden 12 years of survival sense that said, "Don't get involved, don't draw attention, don't give them any reason to make your situation worse." "I saw it," Carter continued. "Saw the way you moved, the tactical assessment in your eyes, and I thought, that's not how regular soldiers move. That's how operators move. But I didn't say anything because, because what difference would it make? You'd been convicted. The system had processed you. Who was going to believe a corrections officer's gut feeling?" "You're believing it now," Marcus said. "Because now I've seen what you can do. Because now Director Thompson is asking questions no one else bothered to ask. Because now it's all making sense." Carter straightened up painfully. "Whatever happens with your case, Reed, I want you to know something. You saved my life. You're a hero in my book, regardless of what any jury said." After Carter left, Marcus lay on his bunk and stared at the ceiling crack he'd been studying for 12 years. But for the first time, he wasn't analyzing structural integrity or calculating how concrete aged. He was thinking about the future, a concept that had been abstract and hopeless for so long that contemplating it felt almost foreign. Sarah Chen would investigate. Thompson would push for reviews. The media attention would force people to look at evidence they'd ignored for over a decade. It wasn't guaranteed to work. Powerful interests had buried him once, and they might succeed in doing so again. But there was momentum now. There were questions being asked in public forums where they couldn't be easily suppressed. There were journalists who smelled a story too big to ignore. Marcus Reed had survived 12 years of death row by accepting he would die here. Now, paradoxically, he had to learn something much harder: how to hope again without letting that hope destroy him if it failed. Outside his cell window, the Montana sky darkened toward evening, stars beginning to emerge in patterns Marcus had memorized over thousands of identical nights. But tonight, those stars looked different somehow. Not like the ceiling of a cage, but like possibilities waiting just beyond reach. Tomorrow, Sarah Chen's story would hit the national news cycle, and Marcus Reed's real fight for justice would finally begin. Sarah Chen's article hit the Washington Chronicle's website, at 6:00 a.m. Eastern Time, 18 hours after her interview with Marcus Reed. By 8:00 a.m., it had been shared 47,000 times across social media. By noon, every major news network was running the story as their lead segment. Marcus knew none of this initially. Death row inmates didn't have internet access or television in their cells. But he could sense the change in the atmosphere. Guards whispering among themselves, looking at him differently, treating him with a respect that hadn't existed before. Even other death row inmates were calling out questions, asking if the rumors were true, if he was really going to get out. Director Thompson arrived at cell D47 at 2:15 p.m., carrying a tablet and wearing an expression Marcus couldn't quite read, something between vindication and apprehension. "Reed, you need to see this," Thompson said, turning the tablet so Marcus could view the screen through the bars. The headline dominated the page: "Hero or Victim? Death row inmates classified military. Past raises questions about controversial conviction." Marcus read rapidly, his trained mind absorbing information with the same efficiency he'd once applied to mission briefings. Chen had done extraordinary work. She'd not only documented his claims but had tracked down corroborating evidence that Marcus himself hadn't known existed. The article detailed how Chen had obtained partial military records through a Freedom of Information Act request. Records that showed Marcus Reed had received commendations for valor that were sealed under national security protocols. She'd interviewed 3 military analysts who examined the security footage from the riot, and all confirmed Marcus's movements were consistent with advanced special operations training. Specifically, the kind employed by Delta Force or SEAL Team 6 operators. But the most damaging revelation came from an unnamed source within the Department of Defense Inspector General's office. According to this source, there had been an investigation into Apex Security Solutions in 2010 for weapons trafficking violations. The investigation had been suddenly closed without explanation, and the lead investigator, a career prosecutor with an impeccable record, had resigned from government service 2 months later. Chen had tracked down that prosecutor, a woman named Elizabeth Morrison, who now worked as a defense attorney in private practice. Morrison had gone on record, carefully skirting classified information restrictions, to say, "There were aspects of the Apex investigation that troubled me deeply. I was prepared to pursue charges when I received direct orders to cease all investigative activities. When I questioned those orders, I was told that national security interests superseded criminal prosecution. Within a month, I understood that staying in government service would require me to compromise my ethics, so I resigned." The implication was clear without violating classification. The Apex investigation had been suppressed by people with enough power to override career prosecutors and shut down corruption probes. Marcus looked up from the tablet, his throat tight. This is more than I ever hoped for." "It gets better," Thompson said, scrolling to show the reader comments section. Thousands of people were expressing outrage, demanding investigations, calling their representatives. Several prominent defense attorneys had already offered pro bono representation. A former federal judge had written an op-ed calling for an immediate review of Marcus's conviction. CNN wants an interview. So does NBC, ABC, and Fox News. The Senate Judiciary Committee has announced they're opening an inquiry into the Apex Security Solutions contracts. 3 congressional representatives have called for a full investigation into your case. Thompson's voice carried a mixture of satisfaction and concern. "You wanted noise, Mr. Reed. You've got a symphony." But Marcus's tactical mind was already identifying the threats that came with this attention. Apex won't take this lying down. They have billions in contracts, connections throughout the intelligence community and defense establishment. They'll fight back. "They already are," Thompson confirmed grimly. He scrolled to another article, this one from a conservative news outlet known for defending military contractors. The headline read, "Convicted Killer Manipulates Media with Unverified Conspiracy Theories." The article, clearly written with input from Apex's legal team, painted Marcus as a desperate man spinning elaborate lies to avoid execution. It emphasized his murder conviction, the fingerprint evidence, the witnesses who'd identified him. It quoted an Apex spokesperson saying, "Mr. Reed's baseless allegations are the desperate fabrications of a convicted murderer." Apex Security Solutions maintains the highest ethical standards and has cooperated fully with every legitimate government inquiry into our operations. Marcus read the counter-narrative with professional detachment. It was exactly what he'd expected. Attack the credibility, emphasize the conviction, dismiss the inconsistencies as conspiracy theories. Classic damage control. "They're going to get uglier," Marcus warned. "They'll dig into my past, look for anything they can use. Military discipline issues, bar fights, relationship problems, anything to make me look unstable or violent." "Let them try," Thompson said with unexpected fierceness. "Sarah Chen has already anticipated that. She's got a follow-up article dropping tomorrow that focuses specifically on the evidentiary problems with your conviction. The recanted witness testimony, the impossibility of your fingerprint appearing at a scene where the perpetrator wore gloves throughout, the fact that your military fingerprints were in a classified database that should have been inaccessible to local law enforcement." Over the next 3 days, Marcus's case became a national phenomenon. Cable news segments debated whether the justice system had failed him. Legal analysts dissected the trial transcripts on air. Military veterans organized online, many of them former special operations personnel who recognized the tactical movements Marcus had displayed during the riot and vouched for his claims about classified service. The public pressure generated results with remarkable speed. On day 4, the Montana Attorney General's office announced they were reviewing the Reed case in light of new information that has come to our attention. On day 5, 2 members of Marcus's former unit came forward publicly, breaking their non-disclosure agreements to confirm the Kandahar operation and the subsequent intimidation they'd faced from Apex representatives. One of them, a former Master Sergeant named David Kerrigan, gave a televised interview that went viral within hours. Kerrigan was 48, with a chest full of combat medals and the weathered look of someone who'd seen too much violence. His credibility was unimpeachable. "Marcus Reed is the most honorable soldier I ever served with," Kerrigan stated, his voice rough with emotion. "When we found those Apex contractors selling weapons to the enemy, Marcus wanted to do the right thing. He wanted justice, and they destroyed him for it. They threatened every member of our team. They made it clear that if we testified, our families would be targets, our careers would be over. We'd face federal prosecution for security violations." Kerrigan looked directly into the camera. "I stayed silent because I was afraid, because I had a wife and kids to protect. But Marcus has been sitting on death row for 12 years for a crime he didn't commit. I can't stay silent anymore. None of us can. If that means I face legal consequences, so be it. But the truth needs to come out." Thompson showed Marcus the interview on the 6th day, and Marcus felt tears threatening for the second time in 12 years. Kerrigan had risked everything, his freedom, his family's security, his future, to tell the truth. Others would follow his example. The dam was breaking. On the 7th day, Marcus received an unexpected visitor. The guard announced it as your new legal counsel, which was confusing because Marcus hadn't hired anyone. His execution date was still technically scheduled for June 14th. Now just 84 days away, and his appeals had been exhausted years ago. The man who walked into the visitation room was in his early 60s, wearing an expensive suit and carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than most public defenders made in a month. He had silver hair, sharp eyes, and the confident bearing of someone who'd spent decades in high-stakes litigation. "Mr. Reed, I'm Jonathan Blackwell. I'm a partner at Morrison, Blackwell & Associates. We specialize in wrongful conviction cases and civil rights litigation." He set his briefcase on the table and extended his hand through the security barrier, which Marcus shook cautiously. "I didn't hire you," Marcus said. "I can't afford you." "You don't need to. We're representing you pro bono. Your case has attracted significant attention, and frankly, the evidentiary problems are so egregious that it's offensive to anyone who believes in the justice system." Blackwell pulled out a thick folder. "I've spent the last week reviewing every aspect of your conviction. Trial transcripts, evidence logs, witness statements, appeals documents, and Mr. Reed, with all due respect to your previous attorneys, your defense was criminally inadequate. He laid out document after document, pointing to specific failures. Your public defender never challenged the chain of custody for the fingerprint evidence, never questioned how a classified military fingerprint ended up in a local law enforcement database, never investigated the witnesses' criminal histories. Both of them had prior convictions for fraud, and one had testified in exchange for leniency on pending charges. Never requested forensic analysis of the gloves shown in the security footage, which would have proven the fingerprint couldn't have been left during the crime. Marcus listened, his analytical mind tracking each point. These were all issues he'd raised himself during his appeals, but judges had ruled them procedurally barred because they weren't raised at trial, a catch-22 that trapped countless defendants with inadequate representation. We're filing an emergency motion for a new trial based on ineffective assistance of counsel, Blackwell continued. We're also filing a motion to stay your execution pending resolution of the new evidence that's emerged, and we're preparing a federal habeas corpus petition that will challenge every aspect of your conviction. The state will fight it, Marcus said. They've already denied every appeal. That was before you became national news, Blackwell countered, before 2 members of your military unit confirmed your story, before a former federal prosecutor implied government corruption, before the Senate Judiciary Committee announced an investigation. The political calculus has changed, Mr. Reed. The Montana Attorney General doesn't want to execute someone who might be innocent when the whole country is watching. Blackwell leaned forward, his expression intense. I'm not going to promise you that we'll win. The legal system is designed to resist revisiting convictions, and we're fighting against powerful interests who want you silenced. But I am promising you this. You're going to have the defense you should have had 12 years ago. Every procedural tool, every evidentiary challenge, every legal argument that should have been made will be made. You're not alone anymore. That evening, Marcus received another visitor, Officer James Carter, now recovered enough to return to light duty. Carter brought something unexpected, a small television that he set up on a cart outside Marcus's cell, positioning it so Marcus could see through the bars. Technically against regulations, Carter admitted, but Director Thompson approved it, said you have a right to see what's happening out there. Carter turned on the television to a news channel, and Marcus watched in surreal disbelief as pundits debated his case, as protesters gathered outside the Montana State Capitol demanding his release, as legal experts analyzed the weaknesses in his conviction. His face, his mugshot from 12 years ago, was displayed constantly, but so were his military photos that someone had leaked, showing a younger Marcus in combat gear, professional and focused. One segment particularly struck him. A former Delta Force operator, his face shadowed for security reasons, was being interviewed about the riot footage. That's not regular military training, the operator said definitively. The way he controls multiple attackers, the precision of his strikes, the non-lethal force despite facing lethal threats, that's Tier 1 operator training. That's years of advanced close-quarters combat. This man was at the tip of the spear. Another segment showed interviews with people in Billings, Montana, some who'd followed his trial, some who'd never questioned his guilt until now. Opinion was divided, but increasingly, people were expressing doubt. I just assumed the jury got it right, one woman said. But seeing all this new information, I don't know anymore. Maybe we got it wrong. As the television played through the evening hours, Marcus Reed realized something profound had shifted. For 12 years he'd been alone, a condemned man whose claims of innocence were dismissed as the predictable protestations of the guilty. But now, thousands of people across the country were questioning his conviction, demanding answers, fighting for justice on his behalf. The system that had failed him so catastrophically was finally, grudgingly being forced to look again. Not because it wanted to, not because it believed in his innocence, but because the pressure had become too great to ignore, and the inconsistencies too glaring to dismiss. Marcus understood tactical situations well enough to know this could still fail. Apex had resources and connections he couldn't match. The state had institutional inertia on its side. His execution date was still approaching, and even the best legal team needed time to build a case strong enough to overturn a 12-year-old conviction. But for the first time since they'd locked him in this cage, Marcus Reed wasn't fighting alone. And that changed everything. The emergency hearing was scheduled for April 3, 2024, 47 days after Sarah Chen's article had transformed Marcus Reed from an anonymous condemned man into a national symbol of justice system failure. The courtroom in Helena, Montana was packed beyond capacity, with journalists standing shoulder to shoulder along the walls, cameras positioned to capture every moment of what legal analysts were calling the most significant wrongful conviction case in a decade. Marcus sat at the defense table in a suit Jonathan Blackwell had provided, the first civilian clothes he'd worn in 12 years. The fabric felt strange against his skin, too soft after years of rough prison uniforms. His hands, free of restraints for the first time in recent memory, rested on the polished wood table. To his right sat Blackwell and two other attorneys from his firm. Behind him, in the gallery's front row, sat Director Harold Thompson, Officer James Carter, and David Kerrigan, the former master sergeant who'd broken his silence about the Kandahar operation. The prosecution table held Montana Assistant Attorney General Patricia Hendricks, a stern woman in her 50s, known for her aggressive defense of convictions on appeal. But her body language suggested discomfort. She'd been handed an assignment no prosecutor wanted, defending a conviction that was disintegrating under national scrutiny. Judge Margaret Sinclair entered at precisely 9:00 a.m. She was 63 years old, a former defense attorney who'd been appointed to the federal bench 8 years earlier. Her reputation was formidable, meticulous, impartial, and completely intolerant of procedural shortcuts or evidentiary games from either side. "This court is now in session," Judge Sinclair announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades navigating complex legal terrain. "We are here to consider an emergency motion for a new trial in the matter of State of Montana versus Marcus Anthony Reed, along with a motion to stay execution pending resolution of newly discovered evidence. Mr. Blackwell, you may proceed." Blackwell stood, and for the next 90 minutes, he systematically dismantled the conviction that had stolen 12 years of Marcus's life. He presented evidence of ineffective assistance of counsel, documenting how Marcus's public defender had failed to challenge the fingerprint evidence, failed to investigate the witnesses, failed to request basic forensic analyses that would have exposed the prosecution's case as circumstantially impossible. "Your Honor," Blackwell said, displaying enlarged photographs on screens throughout the courtroom, "the security footage clearly shows the perpetrator wearing gloves throughout the entire robbery. Yet the prosecution's case rested on a single fingerprint allegedly found on an interior door handle. The laws of physics make this impossible. You cannot leave a fingerprint while wearing gloves." He clicked to the next image, a document from the FBI's fingerprint database. Furthermore, Mr. Reed's fingerprints were classified military records at the time of the crime, sealed under national security protocols that required DoD clearance to access. Yet somehow, a local detective obtained these prints and ran them through standard law enforcement databases. The chain of custody is not just flawed, it suggests deliberate manipulation of classified information. Assistant Attorney General Hendricks objected repeatedly, arguing that these issues should have been raised at trial, that procedural rules prevented relitigating old convictions, that Reed had exhausted his appeals. But Judge Sinclair's expression grew increasingly skeptical as Blackwell presented witness after witness. David Kerrigan testified about the Kandahar operation, about the weapons trafficking he'd witnessed, about the systematic intimidation that had silenced Marcus's entire unit. "We were told that if we testified about what we saw, we'd face federal prosecution for security violations. Our families would be investigated. Our careers would be destroyed. I stayed silent for 12 years because I was afraid. But Marcus Reed has been sitting on death row for a crime he didn't commit because he tried to do the right thing." Elizabeth Morrison, the former DoD prosecutor, testified about the Apex investigation that had been shut down without explanation. "I had evidence of weapons trafficking, falsified contract reports, and potential treason. I was prepared to seek indictments when I received direct orders from officials I cannot name to cease all investigative activities. When I pressed for explanations, I was told that national security interests superseded criminal prosecution. I resigned because I refused to be part of a cover-up." Sarah Chen testified about her investigation, about the two witnesses who'd recanted their identifications, about the detective who'd allegedly pressured them to identify Marcus despite their initial uncertainty. Both witnesses admitted to me that they weren't certain about their identifications. One said explicitly that the detective told him Marcus Reed was a dangerous veteran who needed to be taken off the streets, and that identifying him was the right thing to do for public safety. The most dramatic testimony came from an unexpected source. A forensic analyst named Dr. Robert Chen, who'd reviewed the original fingerprint evidence at Blackwell's request. Dr. Chen was a 30-year veteran of the FBI's fingerprint analysis unit, with credentials that made him virtually unimpeachable. The fingerprint attributed to Mr. Reed has characteristics that concern me greatly, Dr. Chen testified, displaying magnified images of the print. The clarity is unusually perfect. No smudging, no distortion, no partial impression. In 29 years analyzing fingerprints, I've rarely seen prints this perfect from actual crime scenes. They're typically partial, distorted by the surface texture, affected by moisture or contaminants. He clicked to a comparison image. Furthermore, when I examined the original evidence card containing Mr. Reed's military fingerprints, obtained through proper legal channels for this hearing, I noticed something troubling. The print from the crime scene matches Mr. Reed's right index finger with perfect alignment, but the pressure patterns and ridge details suggest it was lifted from a flat surface under controlled conditions, not from gripping a door handle. Judge Sinclair leaned forward. Dr. Chen, are you saying this print was planted? I'm saying the evidence is consistent with a print being transferred from a source document to the crime scene, rather than being deposited naturally through contact. Combined with the impossibility of leaving a clear print while wearing gloves as shown in the security footage, my professional opinion is that this evidence was manufactured. The courtroom erupted. Judge Sinclair gavelled for order, but the damage to the prosecution's case was catastrophic. Even Assistant Attorney General Hendricks looked shaken, conferring urgently with her colleagues. When order was restored, Blackwell called his final witness, Marcus Reed himself. Marcus took the stand with the same measured calm he'd maintained throughout his 12 years of confinement. He'd been trained to handle interrogations, to maintain composure under pressure, and he applied those skills now as Blackwell guided him through his testimony. Marcus described his military service, carefully avoiding classified details while making clear the nature of his training and experience. He described the Kandahar operation, the discovery of American contractors selling weapons to the enemy, his attempts to report the corruption through proper channels. He described his arrest 9 months later, the trial where his public defender seemed overwhelmed and unprepared, the conviction that had stolen his life. Mr. Reed, Blackwell asked, why didn't you testify at your original trial? My attorney advised against it. He said the prosecution would use my military training against me, would paint me as someone capable of the violence described in the charges. He said it was better to rely on the weakness of their evidence. Marcus's voice carried 12 years of regret. I trusted him, I trusted the system, and I've been paying for that trust every day since. Did you commit the murders you were convicted of? No, sir, I did not. I was 200 miles away in Great Falls watching a football game at McGowan's bar. I spoke to the bartender, to several other patrons, but by the time my attorney tried to track them down months later for the trial, most of them had moved or didn't remember me specifically. The bartender had died in a car accident 3 weeks after my arrest. The timing was suspicious, too convenient to be coincidental. Blackwell let that implication hang in the air before continuing. Mr. Reed, during the riot at Iron Gate Federal Penitentiary, you had an opportunity to escape during the chaos. You could have used the situation to your advantage. Why didn't you? Marcus looked at Officer James Carter in the gallery, then back to the courtroom. Because Officer Carter was dying. Because 8 men were about to kill him and I had the training to stop them. Because even though the system failed me, even though I've lost 12 years of my life to a conviction I didn't deserve, I'm still the person I was trained to be. I protect people. I don't abandon them. Marcus testifies with conviction, declaring that his commitment to protect others never faded despite his wrongful conviction. During cross-examination, the prosecution struggles to dispute the overwhelming new evidence proving misconduct in his case. Judge Sinclair returns from recess visibly disturbed. She rules that Marcus received inadequate legal defense, the fingerprint evidence was likely fabricated, and key witnesses were pressured to lie. She grants a new trial, stays his execution, and orders his transfer off death row. The state has 90 days to decide whether to retry the case. She also refers the matter for federal investigation, warning that serious crimes were committed by those who framed him. Over the following weeks, the truth unravels. Emails reveal a conspiracy between Apex Security Solutions executives and a corrupt detective to ensure Marcus's conviction. Multiple offenders are arrested, and a wider pattern of fraud and obstruction is exposed. On May 15, 2024, the Montana Attorney General dismisses all charges, acknowledging Marcus's innocence and apologizing for the 12 years he lost. The next day, he walks out of prison a free man, greeted by supporters and the team who never gave up on him. As he breathes fresh air under the open Montana sky, Marcus experiences true hope, earned through perseverance and integrity. He will receive compensation, testify before Congress, and help reform the system that failed him. But in that moment, he is simply free, choosing to move forward, knowing that even after darkness and injustice, the fight for truth can still prevail.